Welcome to today's session, COVID-19 and WFM, today, tomorrow, and beyond. And today we really are going to be talking about the road ahead for workforce management. We're all being affected by COVID-19. We're being affected as individuals, as employees, as employers, and as managers. And so today we're going to be talking about the topic of COVID-19 and workforce management. And I'm Bob Clements. I am the president of Axiom Group. We'll talk about who Axiom is in a minute, but let me just give you a brief introduction about who I am. So I've been in the workforce management for most of my 30-year career, having built a number of WFM systems. I was also the director of product management back when Infor WFM was WorkBrain. And then I was at Infor for several years after that before I joined Axiom to help lead their industry thought leadership, where I've become kind of a staple of on WFM speaking and writing and things like that. And today I'm the president of the company. Joining me today is Chris Brackett. Chris, would you like to introduce yourself to our audience today?
Sure. Hi, folks. My name is Chris Brackett, and I'm Senior Vice President of Sales here at Axiom. So work very closely with Bob and the rest of our teams to help identify solutions. As Bob said, we'll introduce Axiom here in a second. But in terms of my background, similar to Bob, very similar to Bob, I've been in workforce management for over 20 years now. I started my career with WorkBrain, which was the predecessor to Infor's workforce management solution. Spent several years at Infor in their professional services organization before joining Axiom right about 2009. So been here for a while, and I look forward to our conversation today.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Do you want to give a little bit of an introduction on who Axiom is?
Sure. Essentially, Axiom is a workforce management consulting firm. The only thing we focus on is workforce management. So we bring experts and talent to the organization that can help companies around the world execute their workforce management strategies. We do work around strategic planning related to workforce management. We help with some productivity improvement services as well. And then from a technology perspective, we help deploy workforce management solutions, Infor being a primary solution that we work with. That includes upgrades, that includes enhancements in the day-to-day care and feeding from a maintenance standpoint with that. So we are a global organization. Workforce management's all we do. We service a variety of clients. You can see a variety of logos listed here. Healthcare, manufacturing, public sector, and retail primarily are retail or Infor customers of ours. So, today we're going to talk a little bit about what's happened in our environment and the impacts of workforce management. So there's no question, everybody's keenly aware of the unprecedented times that we're going through. Typically there's these macro events that happen in the world that day-to-day business is somewhat insulated in normal times from those things. So there's stability in planning, there's stability in managing your labor and planning your workforce for the future. Given the unprecedented times with the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the drastic measures that we had to take back in the March and April timeframe from the shelter-in-place kind of orders and businesses in our economy essentially shutting down, and now we're starting to emerge from that. There's a lot of instability around that, and how do you plan for something that's completely new to your operations, that's completely new to your workforce? And so on. So we had a lot of conversations with our clients in the March and April timeframe, a lot of good conversations where people were all wondering, and the topics of those conversations would change on a week-to-week basis. We quickly put in place some measures and made recommendations to our customers related to workforce management to make some of the adjustments that they needed to. But as we've started to emerge from that, we start to think about, the reopening is happening, and then how do we manage for the future? So we're really trying to figure out essentially what comes next. And as the dust starts to settle, what does the future look like? And particularly, how do you plan for that future related to your labor and your workforce management strategies?
Well, and I think that's exactly it. How do you plan for an uncertain future? How do you plan for the unknown? Because certainly that's the area that we're in now, and that's the area that we're going to see for the foreseeable future. So to help for that, what we've done is we put together what we call a workforce management recovery framework. And the WFM recovery framework provides us with an architecture or an outline. It provides us with some guideposts that we can use to navigate the months and the quarters ahead, so we can find a little bit of stability in our workforce management and our labor planning and the way that we operate our businesses. And so what we're going to do this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are, is we're going to walk you through that framework and talk about its implications on workforce management in particular. And I want to start by walking you through kind of the high level structure of the framework. And from our recovery framework, everything starts around reopen. And for whether you were an essential business that was open this entire time, or whether you were a non-essential business that was closed for some period of time, that reopen starting point, that reopen experience may look and feel different. But regardless of what type of business you were, we felt change at that point. For example, some of the grocers that we worked with felt that every day before reopening was like it was a peak time. It almost felt like a holiday in terms of the amount of traffic and the amount of sales that they had, the amount of work that needed to be done, and the amount that they were spending on labor. But once we started getting into reopen and stay-at-home orders got lifted, what they found is that their traffic started slowing down a little bit, and it looked very different than it did before COVID-19 and the stay-at-home orders went in place, but it started to stabilize and it started to flatten relative to what they had experienced during those stay-at-home orders. For those businesses that were deemed non-essential and were closed for a period of time, reopening was obviously a huge sea change and a welcome experience in most cases. Now you were getting people back to work and you were starting to re-engage in business. But getting back to work was different than it was before. And that's kind of where our story begins, is that immediately following reopening, organizations find themselves into what we refer to as the react phase. And the react phase is really a time where we're reacting to the events that are going on around us. And we're finding that we're really focusing on two things at this point. One is to stabilize our business and stabilize our workforce. And two is to learn what it means to operate, learn what it means to manage our workforce during that period of time. Now, what we anticipate is that following the react phase is something that we'll refer to as the refocus phase. And during the refocus phase, what we're taking is those lessons that we learned, and we're figuring out how to operationalize those items. And what we mean by that is that in the react phase, and we'll talk about this in more detail here in just a minute, but in the react phase, we probably implemented new health and safety protocols. We needed to change the way that people worked. We needed to implement new workforce management or different workforce management procedures. And the reality is we slapped those in fairly quickly, and they are pretty gosh darn inefficient in most cases. And as we start thinking about rebuilding our business coming out of COVID, and whether it's increasing production or selling more things or whatever it might be, those processes that we put in place are not going to be scalable, and they're going to really cut into our profitability. And so we need to operationalize those, and then we need to evolve those as the situation, whether that's with COVID or the economy or whatever it might be, evolves. So our refocus phase is really about refocusing on our business, growing revenue, starting to recover as best as we can from the challenges that we experienced during COVID-19, but trying to do that in a way that scales our business profitably and successfully. Following the refocus phase, and this really will start to get us into a time where COVID is something that we're managing very effectively. We can start thinking about reinventing our business. This is really all about the future, and it's about what our business will look like in the future so that we can really optimize and thrive. So let's take a deeper look at each of these phases and talk a little bit about not just the factors that will guide us from one phase to the next, but also talk a little bit about those workforce management. And that's really where we want to focus a lot of our attention is really what it is around our workforce that we need to be thinking about. Now, before I get into that though, I want to say one more thing about the framework and about these phases that we've set up here is that on the surface, they look very linear. We can think that right now we are, sorry, my mouse wasn't working there. Right now, we're kind of at the tail end of the react phase, getting to move into the refocus phase. At least most organizations are. However, we should think about this as not necessarily being linear. We could start working ourselves into the refocus phase only to find that stay-at-home orders need to be reinstituted, which put us back to the reopen phase. And then we might find ourselves accelerating through that react phase much faster than we did before. But nevertheless, we're going to have to pass through that as we get back into refocusing and trying to rebuild that business again. And for organizations that operate across multiple geographies, you may find your foot in different phases based on where that location is. So we may find that one part of the country is back to stay-at-home orders and you've got to revert back to reopen, while another part of the country is doing well, and you can really drive your business forward during the react phase and even approach the reinvent phase. So as we talk about it, keep in mind that this looks very linear, but it may not be. But let's talk about some of those societal events and and then the implication of those events on workforce management. And I want to start with the simple idea that while we're in the react phase, we're going to continue to work from home. Now, for your hourly workers, who are the primary focus of most workforce management technology and processes, they might be going back into your workplace. They might be going back into your plant or your warehouse or your store or whatever it might be, while you still have a segment of people at home. But even for those people that do go into the workplace, they may have a partner or a spouse or a child or somebody like that that's back at home, and they may need special accommodation associated with that particular family or personal situation. Chris, do you want to talk about the next one?
Yeah, and this is I think everybody's seen it, an element of this as we've gone through the reopen and into the react phase. So, customer and employee health and safety concerns are at the forefront of what folks are managing through as you invite customers back into your environment, as you schedule employees back into your environment. And so all of those are impacting the way that we interact together. I mean, social distancing, and how do you institute that within your environment, and what does that mean in terms of volume that you can accommodate, the processes and so on that you need to manage through there. So the health and safety, the cleaning, and primarily the social distancing pieces are events that have happened, certainly.
Well, and so much of that's going to be governed by the geographies in which you operate in, where the municipality or the state or the province, depending on where you are, maybe saying, here are the measures that you need to have in place to be safe. That may not be enough to make your customer and your employees happy. You may need to implement more to make them feel safe in your environment. I guess I'll take the next one here, Chris, and talk a little bit about pent-up demand. I think one of the things that we saw after reopen is many organizations saw an increase in sales due to pent-up demand. I mean, I think we all saw photographs, if not witnessed in person, lines of people waiting to get in retail establishments because they hadn't been able to take care of personal needs during the stay-at-home orders. And I guess the flip side of that pent-up demand, and it's something that we're still experiencing even where I am in outside of Chicago, is that there's also panic buying going on as we see shortages of certain things. Like sometimes it's still hard to find toilet paper or paper towels. It's hard to get meat at certain grocery stores because it's just challenged, and supply chains are being stressed, and people are still panic buying even during this phase.
Yeah. Yeah. Another element that's happened in this react phase, and it's a little bit indicative of the stay-at-home orders and some of the pressure that's built in our society, but ultimately the protests and demonstrations and civil unrest around fairness, diversity, equality, and so on have been a key element of this phase, and those will start to impact again how we manage folks in our environment, what our strategies are to create a more fair and diverse environment and address some of those concerns. But people had the time to go and express themselves in these, and it became a key element. And we may see a revisit of that in some form or fashion in various parts of the country, depending on events that might happen. And again, another thing that's unpredictable and caused instability overall.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And from a workforce management perspective, there's a number of things that you're going to be thinking about in the react phase. And what we've got here really only scratches the surface. But let's talk a little bit about what it is that we mean by some of these items. And again, these may be top of mind for a lot of people right now. And the first is workforce agility. So when we think about workforce management, we often think about technology that we use to help manage our workforce. The key thing there is we need a workforce to manage. And whether we were open or whether we were closed, many companies right now are struggling to maintain the workforce that they need. If they were closed, they may be having challenges getting people to come back to work, either because they're afraid for their health and safety, or maybe they took a job at another company. So filling out that roster can be really challenging, and it requires flexibility, and it requires organizations to be nimble to manage the workforce during this time.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talked about health and safety procedures and the differences of social distancing and the impact in the work environment. So, taking into account the new tasks and procedures that you need to account for, provide time for, plan for, train for, as you welcome your employees back into your environment, or had welcomed your employees back into your environment. I mean, my wife works at an oncology clinic, and an essential company or a function that remained open, but they have so many new procedures, including a screening procedure for anybody that comes into the facility, that they have to take into account and then provide labor for ultimately. So it has an impact on their scheduling. It has an impact on the qualification of the folks that can do that. So all of those things are a component from a workforce management perspective that are in the react phase.
Well, and when you implement those new tasks and processes, what that does is it changes your labor model. It changes the work that people need to do, and therefore it changes the way that you're going to be thinking about scheduling your people. But on top of that, for organizations, whether you're in healthcare or manufacturing or retail or even distribution, where you might be using a more advanced scheduling solution to forecast labor and auto schedule labor based on demand, that concept is broken for most organizations today, or in most workforce management systems today, because those systems often rely on history to be able to create that demand curve and to be able to forecast labor and schedule labor. That history doesn't exist anymore, because it really is a new now. What happened today is not reflective of what happened in the past. And so organizations are having a hard time using auto scheduling functionality as a result. And so something that organizations can do in response is to simplify their scheduling processes right now. And that kind of goes hand in hand with these two previous things that we talked about, which is when we think about workforce agility, you might be pulling people from multiple locations or multiple departments to get things done. When you've got new tasks and new processes, it means the mix of the labor is going to be a little bit different. And at the same time, you also need to kind of simplify that scheduling so you can get people to work when you think you need them, and be a little bit flexible in how you approach that.
And along with that flexibility comes the need for good communication, right? So a lot of changes in your environment, and policy, both procedurally as well. So communication is key. And one of the trends we've seen in workforce management over the last several years that we've already seen start to accelerate coming out of the reopen phase and into the react phase is the adoption of mobile solutions. So being able to provide schedules on a mobile device, being able to communicate, provide outlines of tasks or training and so on. So that adoption and use of mobile technologies to complement workforce management solutions is something we're seeing again as a trend, and that's accelerating.
Well, and so this just really scratches the surface on the types of things that you need to be thinking about from a labor perspective in the react phase. But let's turn our attention to the refocus phase for a minute. And again, looking at those societal examples, one of the things that we'll see during the refocus phase is further loosening of restrictions and revised expectations of our customers and our employees and our businesses as we operate going forward. But then that's going to be offset with this next one.
Right. So, this, and we've seen this already, it's managing the outbreaks or hotspots that may happen across the country, and even across the world on a global basis. So, unfortunately, the virus is still with us, and it's depending on local practices and so on. It's these outbreaks are going to continue to happen, which may force organizations to again move back to a stay-at-home situation, and even close facilities at some point. So managing through that, and as Bob said before, this is not necessarily a linear process. We may need to revisit some of the strategies before. That we implemented back in March, April, May, because of these hotspots.
Well, and as long as we're managing COVID and it's active in our population, the reality is that the governments, wherever you are going to be focused on stimulus efforts. They're going to be focusing on ways to help support and lift up the workers and individuals that may be out of work. As well as looking at ways that they can help support businesses and other activities so that the economy can keep moving forward during this crisis, which again is still going to be going on at this time.
Yep. Yeah. And so speaking of government, one of the things that we have from a linear or a calendar perspective, there are upcoming elections in the U.S. We also have the resolution to some extent of Brexit in the UK at the end of the year. So I talked at the opening about how typically these macro events are, businesses somewhat insulated, but there's no question that changes in U.S. elections and the policy direction that may usher, have an impact on stuff, and people anticipate that this year is, again, a lot of instability and so on. So it'll be interesting to see what the impact ultimately is of the elections, and then Brexit from an international perspective.
Well, and a couple of other calendar events that that often have a big impact or are a stimulus to the economy are back to school, which we're all approaching in the Northern Hemisphere right now, as well as the holidays starting from about U.S. Thanksgiving through New Year's. And during those times, we normally expect to see a great deal of stimulus to the economy as a result of it. And it's one of those things that's very uncertain as we think about COVID. And again, we're going to need to be nimble for as organizations, as employers, and as businesses as we think ahead. But now let's shift our attention and talk about, if those are the societal implementations, let's talk about those WFM implications.
Right. And Bob, you talked a little bit about in the React phase, the simplification of schedules and so on. During this phase, we really see an adjustment of time and work to accommodate workplace capacity limits. So this is really, again, back to social distancing. So can you move some processes, some operations that you have, if you have a limited space? Do you decide to do those in an overnight shift because you can only allow so many people within your environment? Or if you need to institute social distancing in your manufacturing or distribution environment, do you need to run extra shifts because the efficiency with which you run, because the need to spread people out, you're not able to, the throughput isn't as well. So do you need to schedule alternate shifts and adjust the timing of your work and so on? So we're seeing adjustments to that, and we anticipate that. Again, this phase is the dust is starting to settle a little bit, and the timing of work, when that happens, how that happens in your environment, as social distancing and some of the other things happen, I think is an impact certainly on workforce management.
Absolutely. And one of the other things that we can think about in terms of managing due to capacity limits and health and safety concerns are things like onboarding and training, right? Historically, with our hourly workforce, we're used to them showing up, maybe going into a training room, whether that's to do CBT as a group or to have a trainer actually train them on what to do. Maybe there's job shadowing involved. All of this does, though, is increase the number of people that are in your location and create further challenges for social distancing. What this creates, though, is a huge opportunity for organizations to start thinking about how can we start onboarding our new employees using virtual technology, whether it's Zoom or a computer or something along those lines, and how can we train those employees on new processes and procedures remotely. And that's very, very different than we've thought about hourly workers before. But using mobile technology, you can have people clock in and out and record their time, so you're following any wage and hour laws that you have to deal with. You can be using mobile devices or tablets as a way to train people and to provide that onboarding experience. So it's really a kind of an exciting opportunity to reinvent the way that we engage our workforce early on, if we think about how do we do that virtually.
Yeah, and talk about reinvention. Again, this phase is about operationalization. So when we were merging and opening back in the other phase, you know, people were making things up as they went, in a necessary way. This is an opportunity to streamline tasks, revisit those processes, and find efficiencies within those processes. So you start to institutionalize those things, stabilize those processes, and then again, get them reflected back into your planning, scheduling, and training for your employees. I think that the element of spreading, if you have operations spread across different locations, and standardization and so on across those locations is also an element to help streamline those processes.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt. Well, as we start moving into the reinvent phase, our world is going to be different. And it's going to be different from one of two ways. And we can think about the reinvent phase. And even though I said, don't think about this on a timeline or that it may not be linear, ultimately, when we think about where we might be at the reinvent phase, it's going to be next year. It's going to be at the beginning, or maybe as we get into FY or calendar 21 a little bit. And at that point, we may have a vaccine, in which case things can return to normal, but we'll have been living with coronavirus for more than a year. We'll be getting used to social distancing. We'll be used to new procedures, and ultimately we will be different as a society, and have different expectations. And if a vaccine is not available, by the time we start to get into that reinvent phase, we'll have lived with COVID for a year, and we just will have different expectations about work and society and life in general.
And those expectations will need to be fed by budgets, right? So if we turn the calendar or fiscal calendar, new budgets will emerge, and new insight into how businesses are progressing, what revenue we can expect for next year, and even beyond that. So again, a little bit more of that stabilization, but new budgets in the new year, new planning, and so on, to invest in either some of these new processes that we've talked about, and again, still take into account some of the social changes, maybe some diversity programs, and so on and so forth. Will all be driven by new budgets as we progress into the new year.
Well, and we'll also see, as a whole, we're going to be focused on a sustained economic recovery, because once we start to put the COVID fire out and we can start thinking about the future, we're going to be focused on that sustained recovery. How do we grow? How do we, as we said, kind of below the words reinvent there, how do we optimize and thrive kind of in a post-COVID world?
Yeah. Yeah. And from a workforce management perspective, again, if you think strategically about where organizations, how you want to represent yourselves in the market, and then how does that kind of feed down into planning your labor and executing payroll, and so on. Rewriting your customer and employee experience, I think is, going to be appropriate. We're emerging. There's a lot of lessons learned, both from the disease itself, plus again, some of the social unrest and so on. So what kind of organization are we, and where do we want to take our organization as we plan for the future? Do we want to enhance the things we've done? Do we want to take some other things into account? Those are all questions that we see organizations asking themselves. And then how do you manifest that ultimately in your operations and your workforce management planning?
Yeah. Well, and even if during the refocus phase, you do manage to streamline and operationalize, those new processes and tasks, the reality is that we are going to have legacy COVID overhead that we're going to be living with in our reinvent phase. And that means that we're going to have additional labor costs. And that's going to be then added on to by countries and governments as we continue to see rises in minimum wages and increase in health benefits, or increased costs around health benefits and other benefits designed to attract the employees that we want at our organization. And ultimately, that's going to put pressure on profitability. And so as we start thinking about that reinvent phase, then will be a time that we focus on workforce automation to a degree that we never have before. When we think about it just from a workforce management perspective, it's really taking advantage of the artificial intelligence and machine learning that workforce management vendors are starting to put into their workforce management systems, and then the additional enhancements that we'll see over time. Infor Workforce Management 7 included some machine learning capabilities around forecasting, and I think over time, we'll see that go deeper and deeper from an AI perspective. But then on the floor itself, whether that's your shop floor or the hospital floor or your sales floor, I think we also need to look at other ways to automate what's going on around our workforce, whether that's additional software and technology, or whether that's robotics. Ultimately, we're going to need to find a way to manage our labor costs through workforce automation. So at a high level, that represents our framework for recovery. And again, it's intended to provide kind of a map, if you will, for how do we navigate over the next several months and next several quarters as we learn to live with, through, and past COVID. But in the right here and right now, we're all still dealing with COVID and the threat and the risk that it provides to our workforce and our people. And so to that end, Axiom is offering a contact tracing tool. And Chris, do you want to take a minute and talk a little bit about the tool and the opportunity for the people attending today?
Absolutely. So we have developed a contact tracing report, essentially. in Infor's workforce management solution that we're offering for free to our customers or anybody else that has Infor workforce management and needs a solution like this. Essentially, it's able to you're able to define an employee who may have contracted the disease or may be suspect of that, so that you can see what shifts they worked, who else worked on shifts associated with that, and essentially map out from a contact tracing perspective who needs to be contacted and let know that they may be, exposed to this other employee. So it is something we are offering for free. We're happy to demonstrate the solution, the report, and then help install it into your environment if anybody's interested.
Yeah, and it really is something we want to do to help our customers and the people in our community be able to respond and support their workforces as best as they can. This becomes a very easy way to be able to identify who may need to be quarantined, who may need to be tested, no matter what size your workforce is. So again, feel free to reach out to us. And I guess to that end, I did want to include our email addresses here. You can reach out to either Chris or I via the email addresses that are listed on the screen here. We'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have following our webinar today, or help get you set up on our contact tracing and testing or contact tracing tool.